Longtime viewers of this channel have endured many responses to Christian apologist Frank Turek. The reason I've responded to him more than any other apologist is that he so precisely represents the kind of Christianity in which I was raised. His hyper-literal, fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible.
But even if macroevolution were true, and I don't think it is, but even if it were true, that wouldn't mean Christianity was false. It would give us problems for biblical inerrancy in the Old Testament, but it wouldn't mean Christianity was false.
Constant misrepresentation of science.
They're presupposing that God doesn't exist. And they have to operate that way when they go into the laboratory, they think. They have to have this, what's called methodological naturalism. That they have, their method when they do science presupposes that there's no intelligence out there. Okay? And so when they're looking for a cause, they're always going to assume it's a natural cause, even if the evidence points to an intelligent being. So it's more of a philosophical presupposition than it is based on interpreting the evidence properly.
And clear lack of empathy for non-Christians.
She's not a Buddhist now because she thinks it's true. She's a Buddhist now because she wants to say she's spiritual and not have any moral accountability.
Transports me back to a time when I also acted as if I knew the minds of non-believers and the answers to life's biggest questions better than anyone else. Now I see how harmful all of that can be, though, so I try to speak out on it whenever I think I have something useful to say. Turek just released a short video titled, "Does the Bible Say Atheists Don't Exist?" His answer to this question was interesting, so let's give it a watch.
The point about that it was kind of a self-evident for me until I reached Romans 1:20. At that moment, God said that I didn't exist because atheists don't exist because everybody knows about God. If you read it, it said, I didn't have any excuse. He's righteous and he's real. He is the Trinitarian God of the Bible. At that moment, I didn't have that. I am the one that had to demonstrate that he doesn't exist. How do you approach that?
The person asking the question here is referring to the New Testament book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so people are without excuse. Here's Turek's answer to the question.
I think that there are some people out there who genuinely don't believe God exists because they've suppressed the truth so long that God has given up to their own desires, and they're at the end of Romans 1 rather than the beginning. So I don't want to call people who are atheists disingenuous. They may be totally honest, but they've lost the capacity to recognize God exists because God knows they're never coming back and he has given them up.
So he describes atheists as existing in two categories. Category 1, those at the beginning of Romans 1, people suppressing the truth in their wickedness, or in other words, those who secretly believe in God but won't admit it because they want to sin. Category 2, those at the end of Romans 1, people who have suppressed the truth in their wickedness so long that God has given them up, allowing them to truly not believe. To really understand what Turek means by that second category, let's read the last few verses of Romans 1, interpreting the text as Turek does, as applying to all non-Christians even outside of the author's own time. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Yikes. Now, I'm not so sure that the author of this text intended it to be interpreted as Turek does, but we'll come back to that later. It's interesting to me that he doesn't want to call atheists disingenuous, but his explanation of how genuine atheism arises relies on the idea that people purposely suppress what they know to be true because of their own moral failings. I suppose someone could do this so long that they eventually truly stop believing, but is dishonesty not required to start along that path? You're not really refraining from calling atheists dishonest if you're still asserting that all states of atheism necessarily begin with dishonesty. Also, saying that genuine atheists are accurately described by the end of Romans 1 is much more insulting than saying that atheists are dishonest.
You think I'm a liar just because I'm an atheist? No, I'm not calling you a liar. I'm calling you wicked, evil, greedy, depraved, envious, murderous, deceitful, malicious, a slanderer, a gossip, a God-hater, insolent, arrogant, boastful, an inventor of ways of doing evil, disobedient to your parents, lacking understanding, and incapable of fidelity, love, and mercy. That's all I'm saying.
Frank Turek has long painted all those who disagree with Christianity as psychologically broken or morally bankrupt. It's a defining feature of his brand at this point. He even claims that scientists propose hypotheses like the multiverse for no other reason than their own refusal to believe in God, as if scientists are more interested in making statements about Christianity than doing science.
Yeah, it's the multi-universe theory. For those of you that haven't heard about it, it is really a way of getting around the fine-tuning of the universe, because the atheists know that there's no real way to explain why we're here if there is no designer. And so what they've come up with is this multi-universe theory. They'll say intelligent design is not science, yet they know it is, because they can detect design through the fine-tuning argument and say, well, it really looks design, so we're going to try and find a way of explaining this without a designer. All right?
When he makes these claims about the psychology or sociology of non-Christians, he never presents any data to support his positions. Instead, he supports them with melodramatic anecdotes like this one, which he posts every few months on his Twitter. You're raising all of these objections because you're sleeping with your girlfriend. Am I right? All the blood drained from the young man's face. He was caught. He was rejecting God because he didn't like God's morality. And then everybody clapped, right? It does actually make sense that Turek doesn't even attempt to support his claims about psychology with data, though, because his claims can't be supported or falsified by experimentation. Let me explain. So, Turek says that all self-described atheists fall into the two categories we discussed. This is his hypothesis of how the psychology of atheism works. Let's say we want to test this hypothesis to see if it's valid. So, we subject a group of self-described atheists to a polygraph test, asking them if they truly disbelieve and how long they've disbelieved. By the way, I'm not suggesting that polygraphs are always reliable here, as we have reason to believe they aren't, but this is just a hypothetical, so humor me. Turek's hypothesis suggests that we'd expect to find two types of atheists among our experiment's participants. Type 1, those who have been calling themselves atheists for a shorter amount of time and are shown to be lying when asked about their beliefs. And type 2, those who have been calling themselves atheists for a longer amount of time and passed the polygraph test because God has given them over to genuine disbelief. If we didn't find that those who'd been atheists for longer were more likely to pass the polygraph, or that all participants passed the polygraph though, Turek could say that human timescales mean nothing to God, and that he may give up atheists early on as well. He could also say that suppressing the truth in unrighteousness is a spiritual process, not a psychological one, so any lie-detecting measure we use couldn't detect this. The point is, no matter how much we test Turek's hypothesis of atheist psychology, Turek could explain away any of our findings inconsistent with his hypothesis by invoking God or the Spirit. An undetectable, unpredictable, all-powerful force like God, after all, could hypothetically account for any result of any test. This means that if we devise a hypothesis to explain our observations, but we invoke the supernatural within that hypothesis, the hypothesis becomes completely untestable. This is what I mean when I say a claim is unfalsifiable. It's impossible to test, so it can't be confirmed or falsified, making it purely hypothetical and useless as an actual explanation. All of this is why, in my view, this model of atheist psychology isn't so much about explaining the psychology of atheists as much as it's about defending a Christian in-group. It's a defensive, post hoc rationalization of negative feelings about the outgroup, the same kind that drives anti-theists to say religion is a mental illness without any actual data to support the claim. If you're interested in hearing more about how outgroup bias influences the rhetoric of Christian apologists like Frank Turek as well as certain atheists, I have an entire video about that. I'll link it in the description and cards for you to check out. Of course, no talk of unfalsifiability or biased groupish thinking matters to Turek though, because he believes the Pauline epistle of Romans to be the divinely inspired, infallible word of God, applicable not just in the author's own context, but in every context. So no matter how suspiciously groupish or unfalsifiable its claims are when interpreted that way, it can still be assumed to be true. This is where I should point out that assuming that the author of Romans 1 was talking about all non-Christians across all time, not simply those he had difficulty converting in his own day, is a bit strange. Elsewhere in this chapter, the author says that the subjects of his scorn exchanged God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. This scene fits quite well in the context of the ancient Greco-Roman world, but not so well today, especially in reference to non-religious people. Many, if not most Christians, especially outside the US, don't read the Bible in this hyper-literal, fundamentalist-like way, where the context of the author's own time isn't considered. The author probably didn't intend his writing to be applied to Christian conflict with atheists 2,000 years later, and it's not somehow un-Christian to acknowledge that. One can be a Christian and also acknowledge the human psychology that went into the writing of Scripture. There are Christians who acknowledge that the Apostle Paul, like all other authors of biblical texts, was a human being with flaws, and his writing reflects that. Many Christians don't take every word of the Bible as inerrant, and it doesn't make their faith any less real or meaningful. I'm obviously not a Christian myself, but I still think that some Christian perspectives, like the view that biblical literature reflects its human authorship, are more tenable than others. In fact, taking such a stance on biblical literature is wise in this case, because if one doesn't do that, then this passage, Romans 1, conflicts with an argument crucial to many forms of Christianity, the free will theodicy. If that sounds unfamiliar, don't worry, it's just a name for an argument you've almost definitely heard before. I'll explain. When skeptics raise the problem of evil, the idea that the existence of evil or suffering is inconsistent with the supposed omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent nature of the Christian God, one of the most popular Christian responses, which Turek has used himself, is the free will theodicy. That goes something like, humans have free will, and evil and suffering is a result of our own choices, so God isn't to blame. Turek's reading of Romans 1 doesn't fit well with that theodicy, though. That interpretation says that a person loses the capacity to believe in God only when God gives them up. This implies that people only have the capacity to believe in God and escape suffering in hell if God grants them that ability. So if someone truly doesn't believe in God and suffers in hell for it, that's really God's doing, not the person's. Sure, the person pretended not to believe for a while, but they only became an actual atheist, losing any chance of salvation once God gave them up. Free will be damned. If you're a genuine atheist, that was God's choice. As I hope you understand then, it might be preferable from a Christian perspective not to interpret Romans 1 as Turek does. Okay, now that I've offered all my criticisms of Turek's statement, I want to make my motivations for having done so very clear. I don't criticize Turek's ideas because I want all people to become atheists or think atheism is some moral good. It's also not because I think all atheists are so marginalized that criticizing atheism is somehow bigoted. If you want to dunk on Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, go ahead, I really don't care. Here's why I care about what Turek teaches. From what I can tell, the primary audience of apologists like Frank Turek are conservative Christians. Those conservative Christians internalize his teachings and act upon them in encounters with atheists. Those encounters, at least for those conservative enough to consume Frank Turek's content, likely take place primarily with family members who have left the faith. The atheists that younger people in Turek's audience speak to are often siblings, cousins, or friends that grew up in the faith alongside them. For the middle-aged and older people in Turek's audience, the atheists they speak to are most likely their own children. In this specific context, I think Turek's teachings are often destructive to relationships. Say a young person stops believing in God, and when they find the courage to tell their family about it, their parents, siblings, and other family, instead of asking questions and listening, assert, "You really do believe that God exists, but you are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness because you want to sin." After all, the brilliant apologist Frank Turek said this is true of all atheists, and he never encourages Christians to kindly listen to atheists to understand the nuances of their thinking before making assertions about it. He also often takes an adversarial, personally disparaging tone in his sermons about atheists and mocks atheists in memes all over his social media. Then, when his ethics, including how he talks about atheists, are questioned, he retorts, "You have no objective standard by which to judge the morality of my actions." And then he moves on. Never mind that he could simply self-reflect and see if the poor example he sets is acceptable within a Christian moral paradigm. I don't criticize Turek's teachings because I want to defend atheism, hoping more people will become atheists. I criticize his teachings because they're destructive in family relationships between atheists and Christians, and I criticize Turek himself because he sets a poor example for his audience to follow. I, according to Turek, have no objective standard for morality because I'm an atheist though, so my criticism carries absolutely no weight at all for him. He has no reason whatsoever, apparently, to care about an atheist like me complaining that his teachings and influence destroy relationships, so he's just going to ignore me and move on like he's done every other time an atheist has ever criticized his ethics. To close then, I'm going to turn to the Christians in my audience. Many of you have left kind, thoughtful comments or even reached out to me to show your solidarity with my goal of encouraging empathy and complexity within interfaith discourse. I so appreciate that, and I hope you'll be willing to help me out here. If you think dialogue with atheists, especially among friends and family, should start with compassion, listening, and a willingness to see nuance, not generalizations, stereotypes, and assumptions, please say so to your fellow Christians. Make this case from a Christian perspective so that it might sink in with other believers, and do this kindly, of course. Even as an atheist, I think making such a case from a Christian perspective is easily done. Honestly, I don't think much could possibly influence Turek to rethink the statements he's made and apologize for the harm he's caused, because he's never done anything like that throughout his entire career. Maybe, though, if we work together, regardless of our religious differences, we can help those he's influenced to see that thinking of and talking about atheists, or anyone else, in such simplistic, disparaging ways is not acceptable. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe. As always, if you're an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical. A little thank you to the people that are still here. I am working on a video where I go to the Valley of Gehenna in Jerusalem to confront my fear of eternal hellfire. Stay tuned for that.